Splaya, Osh.
3 seconds. One slip. A life swallowed by eternal darkness. No rescue sirens. No cries for help. Only the raging roar of the river, tearing away the fragile body of a wild Mustang Foal. And there, at the razor's edge where death seeped through every cracked stone, a man stood frozen, his breath caught, as a dying gaze broke through the murky water and locked onto his. No one called him to jump. No one spoke his name. But in that moment, every shred of logic turned to ash. Only one heartbeat remained, and he hurled himself into the river of death. That fateful leap didn't just reclaim a life. It ignited a furious blaze, shattering every wall that once divided man and the wild. And when this story ends, you'll find yourself asking, perhaps it is the very creatures we called wild who still know how to believe in miracles. The fourth consecutive day of rain was not mere rain. It was the furious roar of the heavens, striking the earth with whips of water so heavy it crushed everything beneath it. The ground collapsed, rocks shattered, and once gentle streams transformed into raging serpents, slithering madly across the stripped forests. Caleb Morgan pulled his tattered coat tighter, gripping the brim of his wide hat against the howling wind. His deep-set blue eyes stared into the raging Humboldt River below. It was no longer the river he knew. It had become a monstrous python, coiling and swallowing everything within reach, tree branches, boulders, even entire trunks of ancient trees. The stench of wet earth and rotting wood slammed into his senses, thick and metallic. A shrill neigh pierced through the soaking air. Caleb whipped his head around. Across the far bank, amidst the crumbling trees, a herd of wild mustangs huddled together. They stomped the dissolving earth in panic. Leading them was a gray mare, her mud-caked coat clinging to her trembling body, her eyes bloodshot and wild with terror. And beside her, a foal. Small. Fragile. Its legs still wobbly, its chestnut coat soaked and shivering. Caleb held his breath. A large fissure, like the mouth of some ravenous beast, yawned open beneath the foal's tiny hooves. In a moment stretched thin by horror, the earth gave way. The foal slipped. Its terrified cry sliced through the roar of the storm. The mare screamed, lunging forward, but the river had already carved its path between them. Caleb stood frozen. Mud cascaded down the slope beneath him. The river roared like 1,000 demons. "Don't interfere," a voice in his mind thundered. "It's the law. It's nature's way." But Caleb's heart no longer listened to reason. All he could see was a small life being torn apart by a merciless torrent. All he could feel was the desperate, burning gaze of a mother. No one called him. No one ordered him. In a single heartbeat, Caleb Morgan hurled himself into the jaws of the raging flood. The water bit into Caleb's skin like fangs of ice. He plunged beneath the churning surface, arms flailing, fighting for orientation. All his senses fused into a single instinct: save that life. A flash of chestnut brown flickered ahead. Caleb lunged, fingers grazing the soaked mane, only for the foal to thrash violently, slipping from his grasp. "No!" Caleb roared against the drowning river. He dove deeper, lungs screaming for air, the muddy current battering him from every side. His body slammed into a floating log, pain tore across his ribs, but he pushed forward. Somewhere beneath the filth and chaos, he seized the foal again. Clutching it to his chest, he fought the swirling current, kicking and pulling toward the distant, dissolving shore. Each heartbeat was a battle. Each meter won was a war. The foal sagged heavily against him, limp and growing colder by the second. Caleb's boots scraped a submerged root. He pushed off desperately. Mud and debris clogged his mouth and nose. Every breath burned his chest like fire. He could hear the mother mare screaming, an endless, ragged cry of despair and rage from the far bank. The rest of the herd stampeded along the river's edge, their hooves pounding out a frantic funeral drumbeat against the sodden earth. The shoreline was only a few yards away now. But to Caleb, it might as well have been across an ocean. The river fought him, yanking at his legs with invisible claws. The foal slipped again, only Caleb's numb fingers, locked by sheer willpower, kept it from being swept away forever. A branch smashed into his shoulder, tearing his jacket, ripping his skin open. He barely noticed. One step. Then another. Then the sucking mud beneath the river grasped him, threatening to pull him and the foal under again. Not today, Caleb snarled through gritted teeth. Mustering a final, furious burst of strength, he surged forward. With a last desperate heave, he collapsed onto the bank, dragging the foal clear of the murderous flood. He sprawled face down in the sludge, rain hammering his back like iron rods. His breath came in ragged gasps, ripped from a body that had already given more than it had. But he looked up, and the foal was there. Weak. Shaking. Barely breathing. But alive. And Caleb knew the true battle had only just begun. The foal trembled in Caleb's arms, each broken breath hanging by the thinnest thread to life itself. Caleb clutched the small body closer to his chest, shielding it from the raging storm. Mud sucked at his knees, heavy and relentless, as if trying to drag both of them back into the deadly river they had barely escaped. But Caleb didn't move. His entire focus was locked onto the fragile rise and fall of the foal's ribs. A faint whimper escaped the foal's mouth, short and weak, but enough to ignite a burning flare of hope inside Caleb. He wiped the rain from his face, carefully lifting the foal's head into his palms. Tiny, coal-black eyes cracked open, cloudy, exhausted, but unmistakably alive. A tear, warm despite the freezing rain, traced down Caleb's cheek. "You're gonna be okay, little one. I swear it," he whispered, his voice raw and shaking. Caleb gasped for air, stroking the drenched fur, feeling every frail shiver against his fingertips. Across the churning river, the mother horse still stood. Silent, unmoving, a statue carved by grief and fear. The wind whipped her mud-caked coat, but her eyes, those desperate, burning eyes, never once strayed from Caleb and her child. Caleb lifted his gaze, and their eyes met. A look heavy with pain, pleading, and a hope too fierce to die. He understood. This could not end here. The foal needed warmth. He needed care, or everything Caleb had fought for would be meaningless. His hands trembled from the cold, from exhaustion, but he forced them to move. He shrugged off his soaked jacket, though he himself was already shivering violently, and wrapped the foal tightly, as if shielding a fragile flame from a merciless storm. He pressed the tiny creature against his own chest, trying to pour every last drop of warmth he had left into that frail body. "Listen to me," Caleb rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Just make it through tonight. Just hold on till morning." The eastern sky remained dark, but at the farthest edge, a faint fracture of light began to break, a fragile promise of another day. Caleb closed his eyes, clutching the foal even tighter, his battered back exposed to the relentless rain and screaming winds. Beneath the furious storm of the earth and sky, amidst a field of mud and deathly cold, a tiny life clung desperately to every stolen breath. And a man, with nothing left but two bare hands, a shattered heart, and a faith that refused to break, made a vow. Today, death would take no one more. The sun had yet to rise. A murky grayness cloaked the devastated valley. Caleb still sat there, body frozen, his trembling arms shielding the tiny, gasping life he had fought to save. Every fragile breath the foal took felt like a miracle wrestled from death's clutches. Hooves thudded lightly against the muddy ground. Caleb whipped his head around. Across the swollen river, Seraphina emerged, gaunt, her silver-gray coat matted with mud and debris. Each step she took pressed deeper into the depths of despair. Her eyes, no longer wild, no longer filled with fury. Only pain, doubt, and a faint, flickering thread of maternal instinct remained. Caleb and Seraphina locked eyes, through the veil of murky rain, through the primeval fear etched into both their blood. It wasn't the gaze of predator and prey. It was the gaze of two souls, both stripped bare, both desperately reaching for the last scrap of trust left in the world. Seraphina choked on a breath. A scream tore from her throat, sharp as a blade, raw as blood seeping from a wound. Caleb clutched the foal tighter, his entire body rigid. The wind howled. The river swelled higher. Seraphina shifted her stance, her muscles taut like a bowstring stretched to its breaking point. Then, without warning, without hesitation, she leapt into the river of death. The silver form was swallowed instantly. Caleb screamed, a strangled cry torn from his chest but lost to the roaring storm. The river seized Seraphina, twisting her into a mass of mud and bone, slamming her against broken trees and shattered branches. The sickening crack of impacts echoed through the valley. She surfaced, only to be dragged under again. Every time she disappeared beneath the surface, Caleb's heart stopped beating. But Seraphina did not yield. She fought, wildly, against the monstrous force of the flood. Her hooves slashed at the void. Mud and debris wrapped around her like shackles, but every battered fiber of her body refused to surrender. Once more, she surged upward, lifting her head high, her burning eyes locked onto Caleb and the tiny foal. No longer just a beast. No longer merely a wild creature. But a mother, mad with love, willing to tear herself apart for one more fragile breath from her child. Caleb stood frozen, his fists clenched so tight blood drained from his knuckles, his breath breaking with each of Seraphina's desperate struggles. At last, by a force that could only be called a miracle, Seraphina found footing on the slippery mud bank. She dragged herself from the grasp of the river, torn, bleeding, exhausted. But alive. And her eyes, still burning with an unbreakable fire. Seraphina collapsed onto the bank the moment her battered body touched solid ground. She trembled violently, every breath a ragged scrape of life against death. Caleb didn't move. He simply knelt there, shielding the fragile foal, his body a final barrier against the storm's merciless fury. The foal whimpered weakly, curling instinctively into itself. Slowly, painfully, Seraphina forced herself to rise. Step by agonizing step, she staggered toward Caleb. The distance between them, a few meters, stretched wider than the gulf between worlds, the ancient barrier between wild and human. Caleb slowly lowered himself, unfolding his arms to lay the tiny foal down on the cold, muddy earth. Seraphina hesitated, her muzzle quivering as she touched the filthy, rain-soaked coat that wrapped her baby. She sniffed. Slowly. Carefully. With a pain so deep it nearly cracked the air between them. A shuddering breath escaped her. A low, broken whimper, like a sob torn from the bones. She checked every trembling breath, every bruised mark on the foal's frail body. And then, in a movement so slow, so heavy with meaning it froze time, Seraphina turned toward Caleb. And lowered her head. It was not simply a gesture. It was a thank you spoken through the soul. It was an acknowledgement transcending the wildest instincts. It was a silent oath, between two beings, human and horse, that at this moment, every boundary between them had been burned away. Caleb stood motionless. The battered sky above them seemed to shatter into shards of early light. And there, amid the mud, the filthy water, and the open wounds, an invisible thread of trust was stitched between two broken hearts. No words were needed. No promises were spoken. Only faith, glowing in a man's eyes. And in the quiet, humbled bow of a wild soul. The heavy gray sky loomed overhead, mirroring the suffocating stillness between Caleb and Seraphina. The floodwaters hadn't fully receded, and unseen whirlpools still churned beneath the surface. Caleb slowly stepped back, one painstaking step at a time, a ritual as ancient as life itself. It wasn't fear that guided him, but respect for the fragile life trembling in his arms, and for the wary, wild gaze fixed upon him. The wind surged through the valley, carrying the scent of damp earth, blood, and raw mud. Caleb inhaled deeply, feeling every nerve in his body stretch taut, bracing for either a miracle or disaster. Seraphina stood motionless, battered, bloodied, yet her eyes blazed with something rare, not rage, not terror, but the primal instinct to protect, laced with the barest flicker of hope. Caleb crouched even lower, extending his open hands, empty and unguarded, a silent vow. No weapons. No threat. Only reverence. The distance between them, mere steps, felt as wide as an ocean, flooded with the blood-stained memories between man and the wild. Seraphina took a tentative half-step forward. The very air seemed to shiver. Caleb lowered his head even more, his gaze fixed humbly on the muddy ground, an ancient gesture of surrender, peeling away human pride to reveal something raw and pure. And then, in a moment that seemed to halt the spinning of the earth, Seraphina lowered her head in return. No sound. No whinny. Only the whisper of the cold wind brushing the soaked plains, carrying the birth of an invisible bridge, slender, trembling, stretched between man and wild. The breeze carried the scent of wet earth and the faint murmur of running water through the valley. The wild horses gathered at the far edge of the meadow, where the first pale light of morning barely touched the sodden grass. Seraphina stood firm, mud-streaked, battered, her eyes steady like a living beacon. She made no sound, no urging gesture. She simply waited, watching. Caleb, still crouched low in the mud, could feel the weight of 100 hesitant gazes, wary, suspicious, yet flickering with a newborn curiosity. A young colt, legs trembling, ventured a few steps forward, only to jerk back when a gust of wind rattled the bushes. The herd stirred, snorting, hooves pawing uncertainly at the soggy ground. And then, like a thread snapping loose, a young Palomino mare, sleek and radiant under the muted light, stepped cautiously ahead. The herd froze. Caleb forgot to breathe. The mare lowered her head slowly, every muscle in her body quivering between fear and something older, a faint, ancient calling from deep within the earth. Seraphina released a low, soft nicker, not a command, but a whisper, a story older than memory. The young colt, emboldened, followed. His black eyes wide, reflecting the dim light like newborn stars. Caleb felt the heartbeat of the land beneath his fingertips, the tremor of wild souls, teetering between instinct and hope. An older stallion, his dark mane heavy with rain and dust, stepped forward, first one hoof, then another. The herd began to move like a shy river, hesitant yet unstoppable. The wind rose again, carrying the muffled thud of tentative hooves, the snorts of trembling breaths, and, beneath it all, a note of music, like a long-lost hymn stirring from the stones. Caleb bowed his head deeper, his soul flooded with silent gratitude. He did not reach out. He did not speak. He simply stayed still, a silent witness to a miracle being woven in front of him. Seraphina remained motionless, letting the herd choose. The choice was no longer forced by fear, but whispered by something older, deeper. And in the wind, Caleb thought he heard it, the first true whisper between man and wild. Rumors began to spread through the valley like wildfire across dry grass. Cowboys, ranchers, even children playing in the dusty streets of the small town, everyone whispered about it. I swear, they stood no more than 30 feet from my fence yesterday, a burly rancher exclaimed, his beer mug trembling in his hand. They didn't run, another man asked, wide-eyed with disbelief. No, the first insisted. They just stood there. a silver-gray mare, and a chestnut foal. I saw them with my own eyes. In saloons, on weathered porches, at dusty weekend markets, every story ended the same way, with a hushed conclusion. Something has changed. Caleb heard these whispers from afar. He didn't step in. He simply listened. One afternoon, riding through town, Caleb noticed the glances, less guarded, less cold. There were subtle nods, faint smiles, as if they knew he had done something, though no one spoke a word. That night, Caleb sat alone by the fire outside his small cabin. The flames tossed long, twisted shadows against the worn wooden walls. He thought of Seraphina. Of that first lowered head. Of the herd standing silent in the whispering winds. The crackling wood, the scent of burning cedar, wrapped around him like an old, forgotten song. "They're telling the story now," Caleb murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze drifting toward the dark line where the forest met the night. And somewhere out there, in the vastness beyond human sight, a soft whinny rose, long, lilting, twining through the blackness. Like an ancient ballad carried on the wind by souls who had never forgotten how to trust. Caleb closed his eyes, letting his heartbeat merge with something far older and deeper than himself. A new age had begun. Quietly. Irreversibly. That morning, the sky hung low with a misty veil, and the sunlight hovered faintly over the distant hills. Caleb stood alone in the field, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low over weary eyes, his boots caked with mud after a sleepless night. And then, in the hush between heartbeats, they appeared. At first, they were just blurred shapes, faint, shifting ribbons weaving through the morning haze. Gradually, the outlines sharpened, proud necks, flowing manes, steady hooves pressing into the wet grass. Leading them was Seraphina. She moved forward with the certainty of the earth itself, her body a continuation of wind and soil. Behind her, the herd streamed like a living river, grizzled stallions, sleek mares, playful foals whose young coats shimmered in the muted light. Caleb remained still, his heart pounding in his chest, threatening to tear free. He knew this was no aimless migration. This was a choice. A return. An acknowledgement. The herd moved closer, unhurried, each hoofstep deliberate, as if branding the earth with a silent vow. When they were no more than 50 meters away, Seraphina stopped. The herd followed suit, a perfect, unspoken synchrony, as if some ancient drumbeat echoed beneath the land. Caleb removed his hat, bearing his unruly hair to the breeze. He raised his gaze and met Seraphina's eyes. There was no fear. No resentment. Only the quiet acknowledgement, raw, sacred, more binding than any oath. For a moment, time itself seemed to suspend. The wind stilled. The leaves paused mid-fall. Even the insects fell silent, surrendering to the gravity of the moment. A nearby foal whinnied softly, a tremulous, pure note like a bell ringing in a forgotten cathedral. Seraphina turned her head, nuzzling the foal gently, then looked back at Caleb. She didn't need words. Everything necessary had already passed between them through that silent gaze. Slowly, Seraphina led the herd onward, past the edges of Caleb's ranch, across the mist-laden fields, vanishing toward the distant woods. But before she disappeared into the trees, she paused. She looked back. And in her eyes, those eyes once hardened by fear and pain, shone the unmistakable light of choice. For the last time that day, she lowered her head. A gesture of thanks. Of farewell. And perhaps, the first stone laid for a new bridge between their worlds. Caleb's throat tightened. He wanted to call out, to run after them, but he knew better. Some sacred moments were meant only to be witnessed in silence. And so he stood there, motionless, watching until the last whisper of mane and tail melted into the silver fog. From that fateful morning on, Caleb knew they would return. Not on a schedule. Not with warning. Only when the land, the wind, and the ancient rhythms whispered it was time. He made no attempt to seek them out. He simply went about his daily chores, mending fences, checking water troughs, repairing old beams, moving with the quiet reverence of a man tending an altar. And then, on misty afternoons when the sun sank low and the valley held its breath, they came. Serafina and her herd. They never ventured fully onto the ranch. Only hovered at its edges, beneath the withered canopy of ancient trees, like living specters. Caleb would sit on his porch, a cold coffee cup forgotten in his hand, eyes drinking in every subtle movement. A young foal slipping clumsily on dew-slick grass. A mare pausing her grazing to glance curiously toward him. A powerful stallion standing sentinel at the perimeter, his eyes no longer sharpened with suspicion. Serafina remained at the heart of them all, not commanding, not controlling, simply being. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, Caleb caught snippets of soft whinnies, light, playful, like the laughter of children. Sometimes, a bold foal would stray closer to the weathered fence where Caleb sat, inching forward on spindly legs, curiosity warring with caution. And in those stolen, fragile moments, their eyes would meet. No words. No promises. No demands. Just two beings standing on the edges of their worlds, quietly acknowledging one another's existence. One evening, as the sunset spread like a thin silk ribbon across the valley, Serafina turned her gaze fully upon Caleb. Her eyes, once clouded with hurt and guarded mistrust, now held only a quiet acceptance. Caleb bowed his head deeply, slowly. And for the first time, Serafina did not turn away. The breeze sighed, carrying with it the soft snorts of the herd, the rustle of dry grass, the invisible hum of something ancient and enduring. A song written not with notes, but with heartbeats. Caleb understood, this barren stretch of land was no longer just soil and rock. It had become the silent frontier between two worlds. And he, though no one had crowned him, though no one had asked him, had chosen to become its guardian. Not with guns. Not with laws. Not with fences. But with his silent presence, with reverence stripped to its purest form. He changed small habits. Closing the gates during the hours when the herd might wander close, so they wouldn't feel encroached upon. Leaving buckets of clean water near the edges, then retreating far enough not to intrude. Skirting wide around areas where the herd rested when he checked the fences. Caleb never approached them. Never waved. Never tried to tame. He understood. Wild souls needed no leash. They only needed someone willing to walk quietly beside them, without demands, without chains. Each evening, as the sun burned the western hills a molten red, Caleb sat on his porch, eyes lingering on the forest line where the silhouettes of horses melted into the silver mist. Some nights, the sound of distant hooves drifted on the wind. Like the beating of drums from some ancient tribe still singing to the slumbering earth. Some nights, Caleb dreamed of walking among them, no bridle, no saddle, only hearts beating in unison. He never spoke of these things to anyone. This wasn't a story for the noisy taverns or the bustling market meetings. This was a story meant only for the silence. The same way the land had always whispered to the wind for countless centuries. And Caleb made a vow, not with words, but with the quiet way he lived. That this land would forever be a haven for the free. That those who lived between the wild and the human would always find here a stretch of sky where no one would chase them away. No need for signs. No need for fences. No need for sworn oaths. Only a heart willing to bow before what was sacred. And a hand willing to open and close gently to cradle that freedom. Like holding a wild gust of wind in the hollow of his palm. A full year had passed since the day the Mustangs bowed their heads before Caleb. The land had changed, not by the hand of man, but by the will of the wild souls who found their way back. The barren field had become a silent sanctuary where the steps of freedom left invisible yet indelible marks. Each dawn, as pale light brushed the valley, from the deep woods, from forgotten ridges, from places beyond names, new herds quietly appeared. Not in a rush. Not in noise. They came like shifting winds, like rivers returning to ancient beds. At first, the newcomers approached cautiously. Old stallions sniffed the air, their eyes wary. But seeing Seraphina and her band grazing peacefully near the old wooden gate, their doubts slowly melted away. The stiff erect manes, once bristling with fear, softened into ease. They learned not through words, but through watching. That not every human was a threat. That some eyes simply observed, not with hunger, but with respect. That some hands remained open, never grasping. Caleb, too, learned new things. He learned to read the herd's language in the flick of an ear, the swell of a chest. He learned to sense their presence, a subtle warmth pulsing beneath the earth, traveling through blades of wild grass and rough stones. And he learned to become smaller, quieter, a shadow respectful enough not to disturb the sacred currents flowing around him. Thus, season after season, an invisible river carved itself through the valley. It was not the furious torrent that once nearly stole a fragile life. No, this was a river of trust. A patient, relentless river that wore away ancient walls between human and wild, not with violence, but with the soft persistence of water through stone. Caleb stood on his porch, fingers grazing the weathered wood, eyes tracking the shifting silhouettes lost in morning mist. He knew there would be no medals, no monuments. But sometimes, the greatest things are recorded not by men, but by the earth itself. The tiny foal who once struggled against death's current had grown into a magnificent stallion. From trembling, sodden legs barely able to hold his weight, River, the name Caleb whispered only to himself, had become the living embodiment of freedom. His chestnut coat gleamed, polished by sun and wind. His mane rippled like banners of flame against the endless sky. Every movement of River spoke of power restrained by grace, of wildness carried with the elegance of flowing water. Caleb often watched him from behind the old fence, unseen, silent. He witnessed River galloping across the open fields, strong, untamed, beautiful beyond words. He saw River lower his head to drink from a stream, ears flicking gently to the whispers of the wind. He saw River rear high into the twilight air, hooves slicing through the fading light in a dance older than any song. And every time, Caleb's heart swelled, not with ownership, but with awe. He had never touched River. Never tried to break him. Never sought to brand or claim. Freedom was River's alone. But deep in his heart, Caleb had given him a name. River. For the flood that nearly claimed him. For the current he defied. And for the bridge he had become, linking two worlds that once seemed forever apart. Sometimes, late into the night, Caleb would sit on the porch, cup of coffee forgotten in his hands, eyes fixed on the distant hills. There, under the moon's silver gaze, he would whisper the name, River. Not expecting acknowledgement. Not seeking thanks. Only to mark the miracle he had been privileged to witness, the transformation of a fragile life into an unstoppable force of nature. It was an evening without wind. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, setting the sky ablaze with fierce streaks of crimson and gold. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath, suspended between day and night. Caleb stood by the old fence, his shadow stretched long across the withered grass. And there, not far ahead, River. No longer the shivering foal he had once been, but a stallion, proud, untamed, breathtaking. River moved slowly through the field, leading the herd with a natural authority. Each stride was sure, rhythmic, the softness of water, the strength of earth, the absolute freedom of the wind embodied in every motion. Caleb clenched his hands by his sides, heart aching at the raw beauty before him. No one had taught River how to lead. No crown had ever been placed upon him. And that made his triumph all the more dazzling, because he had claimed it on his own. River lifted his head high, ears alert, eyes gleaming dark against the burning sky. He loosed a wild, soaring whinny, a cry that tore through the encroaching night and summoned a thunderous chorus of answering hooves. In that moment, it seemed even the heavens paused. The last light of the sun wrapped itself around River, crowning him in gold, as if he had stepped out of some ancient, sacred legend. Caleb dared not move, dared not breathe. He knew any clumsy action would shatter this fragile miracle. River galloped across the field, foals leaping joyously behind him, while the elder horses stood still, their eyes filled with quiet pride. And at the edge of it all, Seraphina. Older now, her body showing the passage of seasons, but her gaze still fierce and bright, watching her spiritual son with a devotion that needed no words. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, letting the wind carry the pounding of hooves, the laughter of foals, the ancient heartbeat of the earth into his soul. When he opened them, River stood atop the ridge, his form ablaze against the dying sunset. The stallion turned. And, in a moment that struck Caleb's heart like lightning, River's gaze found him. No fear. No resentment. No distance. Only a look, silent, unwavering, as if to say, "I remember." Caleb swallowed hard. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture deeper than any words. Because some things require no language to be eternal. That night, Caleb sat alone on the porch until the stars stitched silver across the sky. No fire. No coffee. Just him, listening to the breath of the earth, feeling his own heartbeat merge with the rhythm of a wild, ancient song. And he knew, deep in his bones, that he had witnessed the birth of a legend. Not through glory. Not through conquest. But through a silent choice, between freedom and trust. A choice so pure, so beautiful, that even words dared not touch it. Day after day, Caleb lived in the quiet, miraculous rhythm of the valley. He no longer sought encounters. He no longer needed moments of proof or recognition. It was enough simply to be. To listen to the wind breathing over the fields. To watch the soft imprint of hooves pressing into the yielding earth. Caleb understood now, more deeply than ever. You don't need to ride the wild souls to understand them. You don't need to possess them to love them. True friendship is not built by holding on. True love does not demand chains. It only requires a heart patient enough to wait, and a soul humble enough to bow before the sacredness that cannot be captured. The days Caleb spent sitting quietly on his porch, watching the breeze play through the horses' flowing manes, were the fullest, most complete days of his life. And there, in a world without words, an invisible bridge had been built. Not made of timber or stone, but of the silent heartbeats between two vastly different worlds, touching each other. A bridge only those brave enough to let go could ever cross. That evening, the sky was draped in a thin shroud of mist, and the setting sun painted soft streaks of orange into the graying horizon. Caleb stood by the old fence, his hand running gently over the wood, smoothed by the years. Far away, on the crest of the hill, Seraphina. Her coat, once vibrant, was now threaded with silver. But her gaze, proud, gentle, wild, was unchanged by time. She stood there for a long time. No call. No signal. Only one final time, and it would be the last. Seraphina lowered her head deeply toward Caleb. A bow more sacred than any ritual devised by men. A gesture heavy with trust, gratitude, and silent farewell. And then, she turned. Her steps were slow but steady, following the winding trail that disappeared into the heart of the wilderness. She did not look back. She did not linger. She left behind only a vast, resounding silence. And an invisible message whispered into the fading light. We understood each other. Even just once, and it was enough to change the world. Caleb stood there, motionless, for a very long time. Until the last of the sunset melted into the earth. Until only the soft sigh of the wind moved through the empty fields. And in that profound silence, he knew. The world had forever changed. There are encounters, even fleeting ones, that are enough to change two souls forever. There are bridges invisible to the eye, but palpable to a heart patient enough to listen, and a soul humble enough to feel. The story of Caleb, Seraphina, and River is not merely about survival, not merely about freedom. It is about trust, about the belief that in a world scarred by doubt and wounds, there still exist places where trust can take root, where understanding can leap across the silent chasms between species. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below. Share your feelings, because your words might reach another soul waiting quietly beyond the horizon. Don't forget to like, share this story, and subscribe to Gallop of Glory, where the legends of trust, freedom, and friendship are kept alive with every beat of the heart. We'll see you again soon, in another story, in another breath of wind, where human and wild hearts meet once more. Because this journey was never meant to truly end.